Hi, I'm Danielle Dufault, and you're watching Animalogic. Today, we're going to try something a little different, and we're going to talk about the history of T-Rex, or maybe how we perceive T-Rex through the times.
First Tyrannosaurus rex officially described was discovered in the Hell Creek Formation in Montana in 1902 by Barnum Brown and Richard Lull. They dug out 36 bones, including a lower jaw, a femur, a few vertebrae, and the pubic bone. All of them were so massive that Henry Field Osborn, the scientist who described it and gave it its name, said, "I propose to make this animal the type of the new genus Tyrannosaurus," in reference to its size, which greatly exceeds that of any carnivorous land animal hitherto described. I'm sure he sounded just like that.
So it was Osborn's colleague, William D. Matthews, who got to be the first to ever illustrate Tyrannosaurus rex in 1905. To have that feather in your cap.
The body was very upright, almost like a kangaroo, with a tail that would drag on the ground when it walked, and tiny little legs that probably wouldn't help it run very fast. But hey, it was the first ever attempt at figuring out what they looked like based on a specimen that was only about 10% complete.
Honestly, this is the first T-Rex ever drawn, and I've seen worse, really, and much more modern. I'd say that they've done an amazing job considering what they were working with. You can see in the illustration that they've colored in a little darker all the bones that they actually found. And that's exactly what they were working with. You know, some parts of the legs, some parts of the pubis, the jaw, an arm, and some vertebrae. So everything else is kind of extrapolation off of other things that we kind of knew about. But everything back then was gray area in terms of knowledge in paleontology. So, you know, the tail, that was all estimated. The rest of that, the hips, just a guess. But what really surprises me is that they did associate that arm with the rest of the skeleton. It must have been, you know, pretty obvious that it belonged to just one individual and that it wasn't mixed in with a bunch of other bones of other creatures. Because if it were me, I would have seen this tiny arm and assumed that it was a baby or a totally different animal's arm that got mixed in. But no, they worked out what kind of crazy anatomy this animal must have had to have tiny little arms and gigantic bones. Yeah. It's incredible.
In 1906, Osborn used other fossils for extra context, and L.M. Sterling produced an updated version of the illustration.
So the same skeleton and generally the same pose. But as you can see, this one here is a lot more detailed. He used a more traditional anatomical illustration style, and this is something that I still use in my work. And you can also see that he has scaled these bones to each other a little more carefully. So I think this was after having a year of spending a lot of time around these bones. This was more than just coloring in a general map. This was detailing what is present and, you know, what was assumed to be there for the rest of the skeleton.
But of course, these are just skeletons. What we want to see is how people imagined the muscles, the skin, and the integument that covered them. It was only 10 years later when the museum commissioned the legendary Charles Knight to paint a full version of the T-Rex based on their fossils. The result was this.
Okay, this one is a classic. Charles R. Knight. He is one of my own paleo art heroes. I mean, anyone who does this kind of thing reveres his work. T-Rex at the time was really perceived as a gargantuan reptile. And it's interesting to see what kind of current influences were used for depicting this animal. And you can actually point it out pretty easily. Some of the biggest reptiles we have today are iguanas. If you look at the way the mouth and the cheek are reconstructed in this piece, like that big cheek scale, that's an iguana. Even the way that the mouth closes, the way that there's lips on it, like scaly lips, just like an iguana. We're gonna come back to that later because the lips is a hot topic. But even the scales on the body, the color green, the stripy tail, All of that screams iguana, and this trend lasted for a long time.
It still had all the major issues of the skeleton-only illustrations, plus one little added mistake. Charles, who had been drawing other theropods, added a third finger onto the T-Rex, assuming that T-Rex would have the same number of fingers as its cousins. Logical enough to me. Despite having an incorrect number of fingers, this painting rocked the nation's socks off and was the inspiration for the 1918 film, The Ghost of Slumber Mountain, where a T-Rex fights a Triceratops.
All right, so next, we've got Dinosaurs Go to the Movies, and this is gonna be T-Rex's big debut on the silver screen. And it was silver screen back then, because this is 1918. So let's give this a little watch. It's a stop motion animation. Oh, you've got Triceratops just walking around, bumping things with their giant horns. You know, that's the classic T-Rex, dragging his tail around, lumbering about. Kind of a slow, powerful predator. He looks so smug, always licking his chops. It's like my cat. This isn't important or anything, but the little like licking his chops on the side thing, probably couldn't do that. I know it's pedantic, but the hyoid bone, so that's the bone that supports the tongue, that was found in one of T-Rex's cousins, Tyrannus. And based on the studies done on that, it was indicated that they probably couldn't stick out their tongue. So it was used for internal manipulation and helping to hold on to prey and other things. And obviously shoving food down its throat. But licking its chops, probably not.
The Ghost of Slumber Mountain was a massive hit and made $100,000 in the box office on a budget of $3,000. In today's terms, that's roughly a $2 million return on a $60,000 investment. The T-Rex was the main attraction, and a star was born.
So after that movie, T-Rex managed to get a few more minor roles into some other lower budget productions. But it wasn't until 1933 that Tyrannosaurus Rex was featured on the big screen. We're talking worldwide blockbuster, 1933's King Kong. So let's watch a clip of that. So like the scales on T-Rex here, they're very detailed, and I gotta say they look almost more crocodilian than iguanodon-y. Is that a word? It is now. So, you know, the idea of T-Rex was continuing to evolve. And maybe, I think around this time we were starting to think of crocodilians as a closely related group to dinosaurs. Oh no! Oh, this is brutal. Ooh. And King Kong broke its jaw. And he's playing with it because of course he is. So for a lot of people around the world, I'd say most people, this was their first view of T-Rex. Because if they weren't keeping up with scientific publications, which wasn't easy at the time, no internet, or they couldn't go to the AMNH, then they really couldn't see T-Rex, you know? So for them, this is what imprinted on everyone's mind when you would say T-Rex. It was this big blockbuster movie. King Kong was no small production either. It cost about $600,000, but it made about $10 million in revenue, which in today's world would be about $250 million. Totally worth the investment. So who do you think would win? One T-Rex or 100 regular-sized gorillas? Let me know in the comments.
7 years later, in 1940, the bar was officially raised by no other than Walt Disney Productions.
This is Disney's Fantasia. And this film is one of my favorites, and I drove my family absolutely crazy watching this daily for probably a couple years as a kid. I was one of those. So what really sets this film apart from everything that came before is that they consulted with an actual paleontologist to advise on the look and the movement and just the whole aspect of how these dinosaurs would move and live. Well, they're so dynamic. Oh my goodness, look at these plodding long necks. Well, that's weird. So there's a bunch of animals here that like, maybe they went through a warp hole and landed all in one place to fight to the death. Because a lot of these animals did not coexist at the same time or place. One of my favorite like little facts in paleontology is that we live closer in time to T-Rex than T-Rex lived to Stegosaurus. And here we have them fighting, and oh my gosh, it's so good. It's such a dynamic battle, but this never could have happened. So the T-Rex, as usual, is still green. It is also still the very ferocious predator that we've been seeing all along, but maybe even more ferocious by the fact that you see its teeth at all times. Up until now, we've been seeing the kind of iguana-style scaly lips that cover the teeth, and obviously when he opens his jaw, then you see them. So one of the big design changes we're seeing here in this T-Rex, like yes, it's still a green tail dragger that's really upright and kind of looks like a man in a suit, but it's lipless. So we're no longer going with the iguanodon, scaly lips kind of look. This one here, you see his teeth out at all times, whether he's gnashing or roaring.
In the painting world, Rudolf Zallinger painted a mural called The Age of Reptiles for the Yale Peabody Museum.
So around the same time that Disney's Fantasia came out, there was a lot of paleo art that was starting to pop up. And sometimes the trends in reconstructing T-Rex were pretty variable. Some of them already looked antiquated by this time.
The T-Rex was included as a gigantic but seemingly slow and awkward beast. Its skin was like that of a lizard, and it seemed like it walked around with its tail on the ground.
I do love the big beefy leg. The big beefy leg is like big, strong, powerful, but then it's got like this big balloon gut. It's interesting. It's definitely got its charm, don't get me wrong. I love Salinger's work. And yet at the same time, along with Disney's Fantasia, Charles Knight made another painting of T-Rex. And this time, the prompt might have been, what's the coolest thing you can imagine ever happening in the history of the world? And so he painted two T-Rexes fighting. Now these T-Rexes, they are looking a little more forward-thinking. I'd say that they're following the more dynamic and less lumbering kind of idea of what a T-Rex would move like. What I find a little weird about this one, though, is the long, snaky whip tail, which we have no idea. Maybe, I can't remember, but maybe at that point we might not have had a full T-Rex tail. We have that now, but at this point in time, I'm gonna guess we didn't. So they were still using kind of the kangaroo tail, but this one's snaky.
This idea of the T-Rex stayed the same until the 70s, a period we called the Dinosaur Renaissance. A paleontologist named John Ostrom suggested that dinosaurs weren't sluggish lizards, but rather smart and fast-moving beasts, more closely related to birds than to iguanas, and that they might be social, unlike most modern reptiles. His colleague, Robert Bacher, went even further, arguing that they were warm-blooded animals. These new ideas led to a little obscure book from 1990 that was then adapted into a tiny movie called Jurassic Park.
This movie changed how we think of dinosaurs in all the ways. Not only were they, sustaining their image as being gigantic, terrifying movie monsters, but they were getting smarter and faster. All of this is kind of a reflection of a total change in how we perceive dinosaurs at the time. It's known as the Dinosaur Renaissance, where we were associating dinosaurs more closely in evolution to birds. So birds are fast, they're intelligent, they are, much more active than, say, a lizard, for example. The Jurassic Park T-Rex is also showing that the way that we think of T-Rex's teeth is starting to change as well. Because you can see that it's got kind of like a gummy flap around its mouth. So you could call them lips, you could debate that one way or another, but it's no longer exactly like the bare teeth all the way out like a crocodile anymore. So this vision of the T-Rex, it stuck around for a long time. I'd say a lot of people still think this is the standard of T-Rex. And who can blame them? It looks totally amazing.
Jurassic Park was released soon after two well-preserved specimens, Wankel and Sue, were discovered. These were the two most complete specimens found up to that point. It was such a big deal that even penguins went to see them. Later, biomechanical studies showed that this was very likely an overcorrection. The T-Rex was a big predator and mostly walked and ran with its body in a horizontal position, like a T, and it was probably not very agile.
In 1999, the BBC released Walking with Dinosaurs, the original one, I mean. And to this day, this is still what most people look to for a litmus test of, is a nature documentary about dinosaurs good or not? They are all still compared to this standard. So this is showing a T-Rex who's fighting an Ankylosaurus in probably the Hell Creek Formation, because that's where they lived at the time. And so this is definitely approaching it from a more naturalistic, factual point of view, using science and sticking to it as best they could to create a narrative that would, inspire people to watch. And what this documentary was really doing differently from everything else we've shown before is that they were framing it like an actual nature documentary, trying to show it, as a real day in the life of these animals, the same way that we might depict lions on the Serengeti. Hey, kitty. Now, jumping all the way to 2023, we've got Apple TV's Prehistoric Planet 2, which is showing something that wasn't really depicted in media before. We've got a fuzzy T-Rex. Another big difference that we're seeing is that this is no longer about trying to create a movie monster to terrify people. They are terrifying in their own right as natural creatures. Showing their own proposed behavior is, in a lot of ways, more fascinating to a lot of people than something that's just, born to trample.
The debate over whether T-Rex had feathers had heated up since 1996, when a theropod called Sinosauropteryx was confirmed to have had feathers. The feathered Caudipteryx and Protoarchaeopteryx were discovered soon after, suggesting this was a common adaptation in theropods, especially among smaller species. In most dinosaurs, feathers were likely used for insulation rather than flight, and this insulation would have been particularly useful to smaller dinos who didn't have the hardware for flight. Then in 2012, Tyrannus, a large theropod and a close but older relative of T-Rex, was discovered to have had feathers, similar to those of an emu. This added weight to the idea that T-Rex might have had feathers, at least on parts of its body or during certain stages of its life.
But by this point, it's totally valid to start exploring, what a feathered T-Rex could look like. In the past several years, there's been a lot of studies and evidence that both advocate for and against the idea of T-Rex having feathers. Now, some of that is the idea that maybe the smaller tyrannosaurids and theropods would probably have some kind of feathers, but they would lose the need for that insulation the larger they got, which is something that you see in mammals today. But dinosaurs were different beasts. Some of the evidence that we've found against the feathery T-Rex theory is that we have fossilized skin impressions of T-Rex from different parts of the body. The idea is that these scales, they wouldn't be able to occupy the same space as the structures necessary to be feathery. So those fossils hint at them being scaly, not feathery.
We still don't know whether T-Rex had feathers, but since many of its relatives did, it's considered likely that it had at least some. It's possible that they were only present during juvenile stages or limited to certain areas of the body. What we did get some closure on is the whole lip debate. We're now pretty sure that the teeth weren't exposed like those of a croc.
In 2023, a new paper came out in Science by Cullen et al. Talking about teeth development and how enamel works in teeth. both in dinosaurs and in extant animals. What was found is that T-Rex probably had lips, or at least some kind of tissue covering the teeth, because it turns out that enamel breaks down when it's exposed to air, so it needs to stay sealed in with lots of saliva. I'd like to talk about the Tyrannosaurus Rex that I got to reconstruct and paint. This is the Black Beauty T-Rex. This is a famous one here in Canada. It's a fairly complete skeleton, and it's called Black Beauty because its bones are pitch black. I got to reconstruct this for the Fukui Prefectural Dinosaur Museum in Japan, and this ended up being part of their dinosaur exhibit all about the North American Cretaceous. And it was a huge honor to do that. So they didn't want a feathery T-Rex, and that's fine and perfectly scientifically acceptable. Either way, right now we don't have enough evidence one way or another, but I'm excited to know what's gonna come next. So there's going to be a lot of physical differences between my reconstruction and what was done in the early 1900s. For example, it was in a much more horizontal position, still very capable of rearing up and raising its head, but its body's balance was more centered around the hips, and the tail and the head would balance each other out a little bit. The tail itself is definitely not dragging. It's holding itself up nice and firm. There's a lot of muscles that run all the way down the tail. If you did like a cross section of that tail, it would be way more round than flat, like we used to see in the early 1900s. And finally, we're going to take a look at the latest depiction of T-Rex. And that's with BBC Earth's Walking with Dinosaurs. Not the 1999 one, this is 2025. It came out last week. I haven't seen this yet. I've been saving it for this moment. Okay. Oh, wow. Yeah, look at all that integument all over its head. It's got some keratin patches over the eyes. Its mouth is sealed shut. I love that the first thing they show you isn't a T-Rex with his mouth wide open. Yeah, this looks like a natural animal. Yeah, and just like in my illustration, you can see that, its spine is held much more horizontal than it used to be. And even so, it doesn't look like it's going to tip over because its muscles and bones are well distributed for its weight. Yeah, this is fantastic. I'm excited to see more of this. I think I'm gonna have to go binge this tonight. So I want to be upfront here that there is so much research out there on T-Rex. It might be the best known dinosaur of all time. And if you wanted to try and track all the evidence for and against things like lips or scales or feathers, you'd be bouncing around the internet from one paper to another for hours. We couldn't exactly encapsulate all of that here, so we're giving you the short notes, but we're trying to do it justice. Thanks so much for coming along and learning about T-Rex with me. What do you think we should talk about next? Please let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for new episodes every week. Thanks for watching. See ya!